Welcome back to my kitchen. My name is Becky if you're new, and this is Acre Homestead, and today we are going to make gnocchis out of all of these potatoes. Now, when I harvested these potatoes with my dad about 2 weeks ago, I noticed that some of them, when I was harvesting them, were starting to grow eyes in the ground, which is really odd to me. Normally you wouldn't expect that until they're ready to grow a new plant. Basically what I think is that I left these potatoes in the ground a little too long and they were wanting to start growing a new plant. So what's happened is in the 2 weeks since I've harvested some of these, they're starting to get soft. So they are not gonna stay in storage for any length of time. Now, this is not all the potatoes. I'm only doing this to the soft potatoes. This potato right here is still very, very firm, no eyes growing on it. So I'm going to save the firm potatoes for later eating. But like this one, when I push on it, it gives a little bit. Totally fine to eat, just not gonna stay in storage. So we're going to take these potatoes, turn them into gnocchi so we can enjoy them throughout the fall and winter. These are some potatoes that I already had upstairs. These were the ones that were downstairs in the food storage room. And I'm gonna peel all these potatoes. I've washed them once, but they definitely need to be washed again. So I figured what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna peel all these potatoes and then we'll get them washed and then we'll start cooking them so we can turn them into mashed potatoes so we then can turn them into gnocchi. We're gonna do another fun project. This one had a little bit of a bad spot running through it, so I'm just going to peel that part off. These are gonna take a while to cook. So while we're waiting for these to cook, we're gonna run out into the garden and we're gonna do another fun project. My mom sent me a recipe she saw on Facebook the other day, and we are going to make basil salt. That's the recipe she saw, and I thought, wow, that looks delicious. I've never tried anything like that before. So we are going to make that, because it only takes a few minutes, while we wait for our potatoes to cook. Some of these potatoes are so big. They probably are some of the biggest potatoes I've ever grown. And if they have like a bad spot running through or anything like that, I'll just make sure I clean it up really nicely. And so it's only nice, beautiful potato going into our pot. The variety of potatoes that I'm peeling here are called red Kennebec, and they are like a red potato, so they aren't going to be as fluffy as, say, a russet potato. I did grow russet potatoes this year, but those are looking really good for fresh eating, so I don't want to turn those into anything when I've got these ones that need to be used up. And I have made gnocchis with all different varieties of potatoes and had very good luck. And so I'm excited to show you how you can take potatoes that look like they could be turning a little bit, whether they're homegrown or store-bought, and turn them into gnocchi that you can enjoy at any time you want. So we can make a really nice, easy convenience meal for later on. I've already filled my really large pot up with water. So I'm gonna take my washed potatoes just so that they don't turn brown while they're sitting and I'm waiting for me to peel the rest of the potatoes. And I'm gonna put them in this pot of water. I don't want to turn on the potatoes yet. I've got just cool room temperature water here until all the potatoes are peeled and in the pot, because I want them to cook at the same rate. And I'm gonna continue that process until all these potatoes are peeled, washed, and ready to go. The history of the gnocchi is kind of interesting. I thought I would look that up. And they've been made in Italy since the Renaissance, but they weren't originally made with potatoes because potatoes were not grown in Italy at that time. Originally, they were made with breadcrumbs as a way to use up stale bread and flour, turned into a little dumpling like pasta, boiled and then served. But in the 16th or 17th century, Spanish explorers brought potatoes over to Italy from South America, and when they started becoming popular in Italy, that's when the gnocchi started being made with potato. And they
really were really popular in northern Italy because potatoes grew really well in northern Italy in the cooler climates. So I thought that was kind of interesting. If you've never had gnocchis before, you can get them in the grocery store in the pasta section, usually in a box. I hope you try making them though, because homemade is delicious.
I'm gonna go ahead and get this pot turned on. I'm gonna get the lid on, and now we have our potatoes cooking. Now I'm gonna go ahead and get my counter cleaned really well, because once we have our potatoes cooked, we're gonna make the gnocchis on the counter. And so I wanna make sure it's nice and clean. But before I do that, I'm gonna go take these out to the compost and get these composted. And actually, while we're out there, we should go ahead and harvest the basil to make the basil salt. Because those potatoes are gonna take a good, I think probably 35 minutes or so to cook. We get to go harvest the basil now, and for one recipe it says that it needs 1/3 cup. I think I want to double it because I think this would make a beautiful Christmas gift. That second succession of zucchinis is really starting to produce now. My first set of zucchini plants are basically almost done. They have powdery mildew, and I'm not upset about it, but I guess we're gonna be having some zucchini for a side for dinner tonight, which I'm happy about. So this, I don't even know if you can call this a recipe. I'll link it down below. It's 1/3 cup packed fresh basil and 1 cup of coarse sea salt. I have my basil here, which is my limiting factor, so I'm just gonna measure this out. And this is a 3/4 measure. I think I'm just gonna take a 1 cup measure. It said you can blend up a little bit of the stems too, because those have good basil flavor, and we're going to process it in the food processor. Okay, I think I have what I'm gonna call 1 cup of packed basil here. And we're going to add this to a food processor. And we're gonna add 2 cups of salt. It says you need a sea salt. I have this Celtic sea salt that's kind of chunky. And I could link this down below for you as well. I think it's really beautiful. It's kind of a gray color. And we need 3 cups since I did 1 cup of basil. The cool thing about this Celtic sea salt is it's a little bit wet. It's just really interesting. It says to pulse for 1 minute or until the basil is completely broken down. That is intoxicating. Oh my goodness. Look at that color. That is beautiful. There is one more step to this salt, and that's we need to dry it out. The recipe says you can dry it out at room temperature or in the oven, and I want to dry it out in room temperature. It just takes longer. It can take about 24 hours to dry.
I think one of the keys to this recipe is to use a very chunky salt, like a very coarse salt, because when you put it through the blender, it's going to break that salt down. and I like to have a salt that has a little bit of texture to it. So this Celtic sea salt worked really well, but you could use like a rock salt or something like that. And I just wouldn't use like a table salt or something that's already super finely ground. It did take about 2 days for it to fully dry, and it did darken the color just a little bit, but it's still absolutely beautiful. And you could get so creative with whatever herbs you have growing to make this.
Now I'm gonna take this tray and I'm just gonna set it on this table for the next 24, 48 hours until it's completely dry. If you were with my dad and I when we harvested the potatoes that we're turning into gnocchi, we also harvested, oh, actually this was a different day. We harvested those potatoes with my mom, but about a week later we harvested these sunflowers from the bed that we had the russet potatoes in, and it's been a week and they look beautiful. I wasn't sure if they were gonna open, and they've opened beautifully. So this is the bouquet. They've just been sitting here. Our potatoes are almost done cooking, so we can kind of prep some of the other ingredients we need for the gnocchi. I did go ahead and get dinner on the stove. I'm gonna make some gnocchis for dinner tonight since I'm making gnocchis. A lot of these gnocchis are gonna be going into the freezer for later use. I've got my silicone mat out because this is where we're gonna roll them out. I have some cookie sheets with some parchment paper because we are gonna what is that called? We are going to flash freeze them in the freezer. When you make gnocchis, you wanna freeze them. Ooh. Oh no, got eggs on here. You wanna freeze them individually, and you wanna freeze them raw. You don't wanna cook them first. So I've got some eggs here because we're gonna need that. And I like to put Parmesan cheese in my gnocchis. I will link a recipe down below. I don't really follow a recipe when I make them. I just go by the texture. My friend and I took a pasta making class years and years and years ago, and one thing they taught us was it's all about the texture, not necessarily a given recipe. So I've got one wedge of Parmesan cheese. I'm gonna go ahead and grate this. I did find a recipe down below that's very similar to how I make it, except she uses ricotta cheese instead of Parmesan cheese. And I sometimes even make gnocchis with leftover mashed potatoes. It doesn't have to be with freshly made potatoes, but I happen to have a lot of potatoes to use up, so that's what we're doing. So I'm gonna get this whole wedge grated, and we're gonna use this whole thing because we've got a lot of gnocchis. You don't have to use cheese in your gnocchis if you don't want to. I'll probably end up cutting my gnocchis on this cutting board too, and not on my silicone mat. My potatoes are tender, so I'm very carefully going to pour them into a colander. I just let these potatoes kind of sit in the sink and continue to drain any extra moisture, and I let them steam, and I let the steam evaporate so that we can have a drier potato when we make our gnocchis. So what I'm gonna do is, these potatoes are nice and tender. I'm gonna take what's called a ricer, and I only ever use this to make gnocchis. And I'm gonna take my potatoes, stick it in my ricer. Looks like I can probably fit, they're very, very hot, 2 in there. And this makes for a very, very soft, smooth gnocchi. So I'm gonna rice all these potatoes. It is a little bit of work to make gnocchis, so I do generally like to make more than just for one meal, because then I can have some in the freezer and we can have a really quick dinner, especially because I've got the different kind of pestos in my freezer. I can open one of those jars, boil some of these up, and I've got a really, really easy dinner.
As I rice these potatoes, I'm going to make a big pile of potatoes so that the steam can continue to evaporate. I want as much of the moisture to evaporate out of these potatoes as possible so that when I go to add the flour, I can add as little flour as possible, because flour is a good thing when you're making gnocchis because you need a little bit of that to form gluten to keep the gnocchis together so they don't fall apart in the boiling process, but it can also cause them to be tough. So I want to add just as much flour as I need to be able to keep the gnocchis together, but not so much that so much gluten is formed that they get tough. And I'll go more into that as we add the flour, but I want as much of this moisture to evaporate as possible. The first time I made gnocchis, I was a harebrained idea, and I just thought, I want to push my culinary abilities on this day. This was before I took that pasta making class, and the recipes all felt very intimidating and overwhelming because a lot of them were super technical. Like you weigh your potatoes and you weigh your flour, and I made them and they were good, but it felt very technical. And then I took that cooking class with my friend, and they went more into not the specifics of weighing and all that, but they went into like why you're doing what you're doing and doing it by feel, so that, you know, if your potatoes have more moisture, you know how to adapt and things like that. And that was really liberating. So I hope to bring that to you today.
Now that we have this very, very big pile of potatoes, it's still pretty warm. I think I'm just gonna let it sit here, and I'm gonna let the steam continue to evaporate. I don't wanna put my eggs in it yet until it's cooled down a little bit. I think what I could do is I'm gonna go ahead and sprinkle my cheese on. Maybe I can clean my cutting board. I probably could put twice as much cheese in here as I have, but this is what I have. I have a little bit more cheese in my fridge, but I want to use it for tonight's dinner. And I did season my water when I was boiling these potatoes, so I did taste my potatoes, and they have a really good seasoning flavor. So I don't need to add any more salt. If I didn't salt my water, I would salt my potatoes.
When I say seasoned my potatoes, I mean that I salted the water very heavily that I boiled these potatoes in, so that the potatoes actually have very good salt and seasoned flavor. Now I'm going to start adding eggs to the potatoes because the potatoes have cooled.
I think for this many gnocchis, I'm going to put 4 whole eggs and 2 egg yolks. I'm gonna whisk these together. I might as well do it right in here instead of getting another bowl dirty. Now I'm gonna start working in flour. I'm probably gonna work in about 4 to 5 cups. This is the part that I really do by feel. I know I'm gonna at least use 2 cups, so I'm gonna start with 2 cups. And I just use my bench scraper and I start working in the flour, the eggs, the potatoes all together. And this is where it's gonna be a lot by feel to try to get the right texture. I already know I'm gonna need more flour, so I'm gonna go ahead and put 1 more cup. I think I'm gonna put 2 more cups. And then I'm gonna call that, I'm gonna reserve some of that here. The goal when you're making gnocchis is to use as much flour as you need to build the structure. So the flour is gonna give you a little bit of gluten development, and it's what's gonna help hold the gnocchis together. But you wanna use as little as possible, because the more you use, you run the risk of the gnocchis becoming gummy and or tough. So to keep it to be nice and light and fluffy, you want to try to use as little flour as possible, but enough to create a dumpling that's going to hold together. Same with kneading. I don't really want to knead the gnocchi like I would pasta so much, because that's what's going to develop more gluten.
I end up using about 6 to 7 cups of flour total with this massive amount of potatoes. And one way, if you're new to this, to kind of figure out if you've got enough flour and you've got the texture you want is to, as you're working it, take some of the dough, roll it into a log. You're not looking for this dough to be firm like a pasta dough. It's going to be sticky, but you want it to be able to hold its shape. And we can use flour when we're rolling out the gnocchis. And one way to test if you want to see if your gnocchis will hold together and to kind of test the texture is get a pot of boiling water on the stove before you start making the dough. And you can, as you're making it, grab some of the dough, roll it out, cut them into gnocchis, throw them in the boiling water, and see what texture you're getting. And that's just a way to kind of test to see if you have enough flour to hold the gnocchis together, and you can test to make sure they're still soft and pillowy. You can always add more flour, but you can't take the flour away. And I'm going to show you just how sticky the dough still is when I consider the dough done. So I'm just still working in flour until we reach the final consistency. And it is a little bit sticky. That's why I'm using the silicone mat.
So this dough is still pretty sticky, but if I take a section of it, I can roll it and it's sticking together. So I think we're gonna go with this, because I don't want to put too much flour in it. So now what I'm gonna do, because we're gonna add more flour as we roll these out. This is gonna make a lot of gnocchi. I'm just gonna cut a section off. I'm going to roll it. It's usually easier to work in smaller chunks. I like small gnocchi. You can make them whatever size you want. They do expand a little bit when you boil them. So I always go on the side of a little bit smaller than too big.
It was through trial and error that we realized that we prefer them to be a little bit on the smaller side as opposed to on the bigger side. So I always try to err smaller because they do puff up in the cooking process. And so I am just, now that I have quite a few logs rolled out, I'm going to take my bench scraper, and I usually do put a little bit of extra flour on top of the gnocchi before I start cutting them into the size I want. The log portion that's already rolled out is not going to stick together because it has flour on it, but the cut end is pretty sticky. And so I have found that if I sprinkle flour on the snakes before I start cutting them, I can then, once I have a few gnocchis cut, I can kind of fluff them in that extra flour, and it coats the ends, the cut ends, so that they don't stick together. So we do prefer them small. These might look a little bit super small right now, but they do expand. And that took quite a few times of making them before I realized that was my problem, is that I need to cut them, or when I first cut them, smaller than I think I need to cut them, because they will cook in the cooking process.
Now what I'm going to do is take a little bit of flour and put it on my cookie sheet. And I'm going to take my pastry knife and just sprinkle these on so they don't touch, or that they're not kind of stuck together. When I first started making gnocchis, I would make them way too big, and I definitely have learned that our preference is a little bit on the smaller side. And traditionally, you would take these gnocchis and you would either roll them over a fork, or you would, there's a little wooden, it's a little wooden thing that's got a bunch of grooves in it, and you would run it along that, and it would put traditional grooves in your gnocchi. Well, we prefer them just like that, just little tiny dumplings. So these might not be the most traditional, but these are the way we like it. And when I make sweet potato gnocchis, I make them almost exactly the same way, except I make them with sweet potato instead of white potato. And those are so good in the fall when broccoli is in season again, cold winter crops and sausage, and you fry them up with some brown butter and sage. So good. But we're not making those today. We're making just plain potato gnocchis, and these are just as good. The cool thing about these type of gnocchis is the flavor you want to put with them is a little bit more, what's the word? You can get a little bit more creative. So I'm just, like I'm doing here, I'm just gonna cut a bunch of these. When I have a full tray that's full, I'll go throw these in the freezer and flash freeze them. These are a little bit easier to roll out even just for the minute they've been sitting here. The gluten has had a chance to kind of relax a little bit. So I think what I'm gonna do is go ahead and roll out a bunch of these medium-sized snakes, and then I will go through and finally roll them because they're easier to work with when the gluten has had a chance to kind of settle down and relax. So this dough is very sticky, but it's not, it's workable. Let me show you. So it's sticky if you let it get really sticky, but if you can keep it nice and floured, it's definitely workable.
Gluten is a protein that is made from two different proteins that are naturally found in flour. And in the presence of water or moisture or kneading, those two proteins come together and they form gluten. And gluten is the backbone for a lot of breads and pastas and things like that. It's what holds things together. And so what happens when you start working any sort of dough and you have more gluten development, it can be a little bit harder to roll out, and it's kind of like a rubber band. So if you let your pasta rest for a little bit, your pasta dough, it kind of relaxes the gluten a little bit and becomes easier to work with. So that's why I have found that it works really well if I roll out quite a few logs of gnocchi dough before I roll it into its skinny log shape. For some reason, it just tends to roll out nicer when I have some that have been rolled out and give them a minute to rest before making them super small or into my desired shape. Another way you can shape this is once you cut them into your desired shape gnocchis, you can actually take your finger and push into each individual one, create a little indent. And traditionally, the reason gnocchis have little grooves or indents in them is because it allows the sauce to nestle its way into that groove or indent and hold on to the sauce better. But I don't tend to do that. This is how I make them. So they're not as traditional, but still to us just as delicious.
I still have all this dough to go through, but I am gonna run out of cookie sheet space real quick. So I'm gonna go pop these in the freezer just so that these can start to harden while I just continue to roll snakes and cut gnocchi.
One reason I tend to make more than one recipe's worth of gnocchi is it does make a little bit of a mess in the kitchen. And so I figure I might as well get more than one meal's worth. And that's typically how I make my gnocchi. I'll make a big batch and then I don't have to make it for a while. Unless I have leftover mashed potatoes or mashed sweet potatoes, I will sometimes make gnocchis out of them just as a way to use up leftover mashed potatoes. But if you have a friend that would enjoy hanging out with you and doing this together, that would be really fun. I was just thinking it would be really fun to do a gnocchi making party where, you have a few people, you make a ton of gnocchi, and then you cook a bunch of it up, you get a bunch of it in the freezer, and everyone can go home with a bunch of homemade gnocchi, and you can also enjoy a really delicious dinner. And the company would be welcome on a day like today. Maybe I'll have to do that next year or come winter when the last of the potatoes start to get soft and I need to make some more gnocchi. So one reason I do tend to make a lot, like I said, is because it does make a mess a little bit. And this is the first time I've used my silicone mat when making gnocchi, and it was very, very helpful Because I have granite tile countertops, whenever I make gnocchis or any pasta or any pastry of any kind, I tend to not enjoy rolling it out on the grout line. And so this silicone mat has been a huge upgrade. And because gnocchi dough is so sticky, anywhere the gnocchi dough is on the counter, it did take quite a bit of elbow grease to get it up off the counter. And so if you have tile countertops, I would highly recommend a silicone mat, not just for gnocchi, but I use this if you've seen me make any sort of pastries, or anytime I need to roll anything out, this silicone mat has really been helpful because of my tile countertops. So as I roll them out, I'm just putting them on the cookie sheet and I'm getting them directly into the freezer. The gnocchis did tend to get a little bit bigger as I was finishing. I think I was just ready to be done.
Every single cookie sheet and drying rack I own is covered with gnocchi. This is the last of the gnocchi. Everything I own is covered in flour, but it's been fantastic to get this much done. It's been a long time since I've been able to set aside some time to make them in bulk. So now I'm gonna go ahead and get these boiled for dinner tonight. So I need to get some water on to boil. And I think, because I threw those in the freezer, but I don't actually need to freeze them if I'm gonna cook them. I'm going to just fluff them a little bit. This is more than we need for dinner tonight, but whatever we don't end up putting into the pot of water to boil, I'll throw in the freezer. While my water's filling up, if you are new to making gnocchi and you're not sure if you have enough flour or anything in to keep the gnocchis bind together, what you can do is you can actually make up your dough, boil some water, and put your gnocchis in the water to boil and see if they hold up. And then you can taste test them too. You can see if they're still light and fluffy and if you need to add any more seasoning. We are making a bolognese bake where we're gonna take our gnocchis, put them in this bolognese sauce that's been cooking but the whole time we have been in the kitchen, and it smells incredible. So we can get some water on to boil, and while my water is boiling, I think I might start cleaning up my mess a little bit, covered in flour.
For the bolognese sauce, earlier this day, I browned 1 pound of ground beef along with some veggies, celery, carrot, and onion, garlic, seasonings, and tomato sauce and diced tomatoes. And I've had this cooking the whole time we've been in the kitchen. I am gonna have a full tutorial on this video, or on this recipe, but it will be in a different video. It'll be in Not Your Mama's Casseroles, and we make 5 casseroles together.
I decided to change my apron because that one was just a little too far gone. I'm going to go ahead and put these gnocchis back onto this cookie sheet because I want to be able to clean this counter. So I'm going to take a second to get these on here. I just checked the gnocchis that are in the freezers. As I've been filling up different cookie sheets and things, I threw them in the freezer. Once they're completely frozen, I'm gonna take them out of the freezer and put them in about 1-ish pounds or so. I'll probably just guesstimate 1-ish pounds. Here's an example of some that are already starting to freeze, but they're still not frozen. And then I'll put them in, I'll vacuum seal them so that they'll stay fresh in the freezer, and we'll be able to enjoy these all winter long, and I can have a really quick and easy dinner and a really hearty and comforting dinner rather than go through the effort of making them. One of our favorites is potato gnocchi soup. So good. Or chicken gnocchi soup, not potato. The potatoes are made, or the gnocchis are made with potatoes. It's been a while. I've been in the kitchen for a while. I can't speak. I do these big cooking days or big cooking projects, and it may seem like I'm always in the kitchen, but I'm not. I like to do these big cooking days because I enjoy it, but also it allows me to have days where if I don't want to cook or if I don't have time, I can whip something together really quickly, and it can be homemade and we can enjoy it, but I don't have to spend a lot of time in the kitchen. And tonight's dinner is gonna be enough for us to be able to enjoy it tonight and for the next few days for lunches and dinners. So I probably won't even have to cook at all tomorrow. I'm really glad I did the majority of rolling out the gnocchi on that silicone mat, because where the gnocchi dough touched my countertops, it's gonna take me a second to get all of this sticky stuff up because it's dried a little bit. My water's almost boiling.
To cook gnocchis, you cook them the same whether you cook them from frozen or fresh. These are obviously fresh, so what I'm gonna do is I've got a pot of boiling water and I'm gonna cook them until they float to the top. Once they float to the top, whether they are fresh or frozen, you know they are done. It takes about 4 minutes or so, give or take, if you're cooking them from fresh or not. I'm gonna add my gnocchis directly to my bolognese sauce, and then I'm gonna top that casserole with cheese, get that in the oven until bubbly, and this was an incredible recipe. So I will link that recipe down below for you if you're interested in that recipe, and the video as well where we make the full tutorial on it. But it is now the next day, and here are the frozen gnocchi. We end up getting 12 one-ish pound packages of gnocchi for later use. They're completely frozen. I'm gonna take the gnocchis and I'm gonna put them into my food saver bags. These are 1 quart food saver bags, and I'm portioning them out, give or take, into about 1 pound portions. And then I am gonna vacuum seal them up. Then I'm gonna pop them in the freezer and cook them from frozen whenever we want gnocchi. One way we really like to have gnocchi is after you boil them, strain them, and then put them in a very hot pan with some oil, pan fry them, and then make a sauce, and then they get kind of crispy on the outside. That is another really delicious way to have gnocchis. You've got your pillowy inside and your crispy outside. But I have to say that bolognese gnocchi bake was phenomenal, and that was a new recipe to me, and I will make that again and again. It was so delicious. So here I am vacuum sealing them. We got 12 recipes worth of gnocchi. Friend, if you enjoyed this video, I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for taking time out of your day to spend time with me in the kitchen. I can pop a couple of my other videos up here. You can go enjoy between now and my next upload. I hope you are having a fantastic day, and I can't wait to see you next time. Bye, friend.